Good morning, everyone. If you could please take your seats, I hope that you have had a good night's rest. Welcome to day 2 of our conference, Essays Beyond Borders. So the project is titled Essays Beyond Borders, as you by now know. But as everyone who, like myself, is a Trekkie, knows, the final frontier is space. So I'm very curious about today's keynote lecture, which is going to take us beyond the borders, not only of our planet, but even of our solar system. Today's keynote speaker is Kara Wittman, who is an associate professor of teaching in the Department of English at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research and teaching areas include the history, theory, and politics of the essay, 18th and 19th century British literature, ekphrastic art, and critical pedagogy. Her work on the essay appears or is forthcoming in The Critic as Amateur, Failure Pedagogies, the Edinburgh Companion to the Essay, the Cambridge History of the British Essay, Countertext, and Teaching the American Essay. She's also the editor, together with Evan Kindley, of the Cambridge Companion to the Essay. So join me in welcoming Kara Wittman.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? There was a time when I taught a class and didn't ask that, and 1/3 of the way through the term, the students in the back informed me that they couldn't hear me at all, and hadn't. It's great to be here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizers. This is a beautiful conference, beautifully organized, beautifully conceived. And I'm grateful to play a part in it. I'm also grateful to all of you, my colleagues, and to the students for creating what is an intellectual home for those of us who wander. It's in that sense nice to be home. But we're going to leave home now for outer space. Broadly speaking, this is a talk about outer space. The desire to go wandering among the planets, a desire that, at its best moments, seems itself an essayistic gesture, is very old. The blurry form of actual space exploration emerged in the 1930s as various European, Soviet, and American rocketry enthusiasts formed such amateur extramilitary organizations as the Society for Space Travel, the British Interplanetary Society, and the American Rocket Society. And experimented with launching liquid propellant rockets. Military and government-funded space programs grew out of the United States and the Soviet Union's capture of V-2 rocket hardware and engineering personnel in the 1940s. By 1969, humans had orbited the Earth, orbited the Moon, and taken steps on the lunar surface. All of these things changed our notion of the planet, the planetary, in fundamental ways. In 1972, NASA launched the first spacecraft meant to go further than Mars, the Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11. Affixed to these probes were rudimentary gold anodized aluminum plaques intended to, quote, carry some indication of the locale, epoch, and nature of the spacecraft builders. The process was hasty, and the designers recognized that they, quote, made some assumptions about both the cultural perspective represented on the plaques and the intelligence of the extraterrestrials imagined as the recipients. You can see in the blurry photograph the plaque actually affixed to the Pioneer. In 1976, the architects of the Pioneer plaques got a second chance. The project manager for the Voyager space probes invited astronomer, planetary scientist, and space diplomat Carl Sagan and his team to affix a message to Voyager 1 and 2. These probes were destined for the outer planets, the gas giants, and everyone involved had some sense that the probes might continue into interstellar space. When the Voyagers launched in the fall of 1977, each carried a long-playing gold-plated copper phonograph record. Stored on this golden record is a collection of languages, sounds, and images meant to represent planet Earth. They take the form, the designers tell us, of an essay. This talk is about that essay, which makes it as much about planet Earth as it is about outer space. The complex and painstaking creation of this extraplanetary essay can tell us a lot about the planetary essay. I want to consider today how the extreme nature of the Voyager Golden Record project sets in stark relief some of the questions that animate a study of the planetary essay and our thinking of the planetary, questions that animated and haunted the design of the Golden Record itself. How might an essay represent global and ecological interconnectedness? What self-representation is at once true, durable, and decipherable? What can the essay form teach us about representing a planet self, a diverse but necessarily associated and hopefully dialogic set of values and identities? How does such a demand for representation require the consciousness of non-identity integral to the form? And how might we signal that fragile particularity without flattening it or subsuming it into yet another system? Before I get to the Golden Record, which first left the heliosphere and entered interstellar space in 2012, Voyager 1 is now about 25 billion kilometers away, I want to consider some emergent reciprocities between the essay form and planetary thinking on Earth in the 3 decades leading up to the Voyager launch, points of contact that may help us understand what this extraplanetary essay has to teach us about the essay as a planetary form. Oh, hello. In 1937, deep in the Great Depression, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the Farm Security Administration to, quote, resettle poor farmers on more productive land, promote soil conservation, and provide emergency relief. The director of the publicity department, Rexford Tugwell, commissioned an economics professor to hire photographers who might record the project. These photographers were to document Depression-era life in the United States, both the straitened land and the people struggling to survive on it. The commission led to some of the earliest photo essays in the United States and elsewhere, and forced a reckoning with the relationship between ethnography, documentary, and essayism. Among these photographers was Walker Evans, who, paired with the poet and journalist James Agee, traveled to the American South to document the sharecroppers. Their work was actually commissioned by Fortune magazine, still in its social consciousness phase, in the spirit of the FSA assignments. Agee and Evans found the assignment, quote, obscene, and set out to reimagine how one might represent, quote, the whole memory of the South in its 6,000-mile parade and flowering outlay of the facades of cities, of the wide, wild opening of the tragic land, the fleet, flush, and flower of the human crop it raises. Their effort, let us now praise famous men, is instructive for us today. Agee is explicit that the form their work takes cannot be a novel, for some of the same reason Amitav Ghosh will articulate almost a century later about why the novel might meet its limits in representing the scale of climate devastation. Quote, in a novel, Agee writes, a house or person has his meaning, his existence, entirely through the writer. Here, a house or person has only the most limited of his meaning through me. His true meaning is much huger. They choose instead to present a sequence of unframed, uncontextualized gelatin silver print photographs, and then a written essay. The book opens, no title page or even flyleaf, with 46 pages of uncaptioned photographs of particulars, faces, porches, boots, graves, and then continues into nearly 400 pages of lyrical, digressive, and sometimes contumacious essayistic prose. There is no other way, A.G. tells us, in language that echoes Frankfurt School theories of the essay. What gesture they have to make in this project must be discerned, quote, without either dissection into science or digestion into art. There opens before consciousness, A.G. writes, a universe luminous, spacious, incalculably rich, and wonderful in each detail, as relaxed and natural to the human swimmer, and as full of glory as his breathing, and that it is possible to capture and communicate this universe not so well by means of art as through such open terms as I am trying it under. We might recognize these open terms as the essay, a form able to represent both the particularity of Annie Mae Gudger, a tenant farmer in 1936 Alabama, and the incalculably rich universe, coextensive with time itself, in which we must necessarily understand her. What form is elastic enough, open-ended enough? What form doesn't necessarily make us choose between scales? A.G. refers to his essay as a sonata, a musical form that works by introducing a theme, modulating and developing that theme, experimenting with the harmonic and textual possibilities, and finally recapitulating the thematic material, which includes the tonic resolution of the musical argument. Sonatas, like fugues and dialectics, typically have 3 parts. The tonic resolution is the third, but A.G. and Evans' work realizes only the first 2, which leaves open their harmonic and textual experimentation. Their sonata doesn't resolve. It remains an invitation, as Christy Walpole suggests, to continue dreaming, digressing. As if to underline this irresolution, the book ends with the image of 2 creatures, maybe foxes, calling to each other late into the Alabama night, their music running through, quote, any number of rhythmic, dramatic devices, and, quote, never repeating a pattern. I linger on Let Us Now Praise Famous Men because A.G. seems to define the problem of planetary representation avant la lettre, and even before post-war calls for whole Earth images and whole Earth consciousness emerge. A.G. does not know how to represent the, quote, globular structure of the universe, to represent at once the planet, the local history and situation, and the individual, the, quote, interlocking bubbles on the face of a stream. He says that he would, and I quote, use fragments of cloth, bits of cotton, lumps of earth, records of speech, pieces of wood and iron, files of odors, plates of food and excrement, if he could. In fact, his list bears a striking resemblance to what the authors of the Voyager essay wanted to include on their interstellar record. But like them, A.G. has to settle for the essay. 1/3 of the way into this sprawling work, he returns to the problem of form. He has called his essay a sonata, but his modulated and unresolved themes are still bound by the syntactic demands of the written word. How might we, quote, alien beings, their imagined readers with alien bodiless eyes, that's us, understand what A.G. and Evans represent is incomplete, specks in the firmament and graveyard of earth and time? A.G.'s answer, this is all one colon. The chapter in which this appears, colon, consists of pages and pages of prose punctuated only by colons, sentences shaped according to the rules of the colon: exemplification, amplification, announcement, extrapolation, explanation, lists, descriptions, a logical consequence. And, important for an essay modulating such scales, the demarcation between hour, minute, and second. The colon gestures to what comes after, suggesting both what it can include in a sentence and what, as in the logic of any list, it cannot. It also points backward at the independent clause that occasioned this extrapolation. A.G. writes, "All this takes meaning from a certain center which we shall be unable to keep steadily before your eyes, that should be written, should be listed, calculated, analyzed, conjectured upon, as if all in one sense and spread suspension or flight or fugue of music, and that I shall not be able to sustain it, or so to sustain its intensity toward this center human life, so yield it out, so that it all strikes upon this center, inward upon this center at once, and in all its intersections, and in the meaning of its interrelations and interenhancements. It is this which so paralyzes me, yet one can write only one word at a time. Whence, let me hope that the whole of the landscape we shall essay to travel in is visible, and may be known there as there all at once. Let this be borne in mind, in order that, when we descend among its windings and blockades, into examination of slender particulars, this, its wholeness and simultaneous living map, may not be neglected, however lost the breadth of the country may be in the winding walk of each sentence." The colon here is at once compass and sextant, gravestone and guidepost, signal lamp and suture, and we will return to the winding walk of these sentences, these fugal flights, when we turn to tracking them in space. Here, suffice it to say that Fortune magazine wanted nothing to do with A.G. and Evans' wandering, strange, and possibly communist eidolon. It came out in book form in 1941 and was a commercial failure. The photo essays produced by the FSA became increasingly jingoistic as World War II stretched on, more recognizable as the totalitarian forms against which Theodor Adorno identifies his heretical essay. As the space program grew out of wartime ambitions and technology, a new sense of planet Earth emerged. Efforts to imagine the globular, not the flat Earth, which has not, throughout history, been as persuasive a description as today's flat Earth society would have us imagine, are at least as old as Socrates' description in the Phaedo of Earth as a party-colored globe, like those balls stitched together from 12 pieces, balanced at the center of the heavens, probably older. During World War II, the poet and essayist Archibald MacLeish enters this tradition by imagining the, quote, airmen's Earth, a globe we no longer have to imagine but can see, quote, a round Earth in which all directions eventually meet, in which there is no center because every point, or none, is center, an equal Earth which all men occupy as equals. Essayists in the 1944 collection Compass of the World, a symposium on political geography, tried to imagine how inexplicable national and political borders would be to a, quote, stranger to our planet. He would, they concluded, be dumbfounded. Advanced balloons, V-2 rockets, and early satellite images increased the appetite for seeing the whole Earth and ushered in a certain kind of planetary imagination, one, I would suggest, less essayistic and more messianic. But we can learn something from it, and certainly something about the path the Voyager essayists understood they might need to avoid. The relationship between planetary thinking, the essay, and the photographs of the whole Earth at this moment in the 20th century is perhaps best embodied in the figure of Stuart Brand, acolyte of Buckminster Fuller and his spaceship Earth, entrepreneur, countercultural agitator, military parachutist, and writer. During an LSD trip on a San Francisco rooftop in 1966, it occurred to Brand that we would better understand ourselves, our place in Earth's ecosystem, and our debt to our home if we could just see an image of the whole planet. He thus launched his campaign, "Why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet?" creating buttons bearing the question that he distributed widely, including sending them to members of Congress and NASA administrators. The reason for the campaign, born from more than a whiff of conspiracy thinking, Brand puts this way: "There we were in 1966, having seen a lot of the moon and a lot of hunks of Earth, but never the complete mandala. It was a bit odd that for 10 years, with all the photographic apparatus in the world, we hadn't turned the cameras 180 degrees to look back." As Christian Mararu puts it, this Levinasian facing the Earth, a consideration of and for the planet's luminously elusive yet exigent face, might offer grounds for a new critical theoretical ethic, an essayistic engagement with questions of how we look at the world and what we notice. What epistemology grounds our ethico-political engagement with our planet? For Mararu, quote, "Literary planetarism illuminates and helps us discern a physiognomy of planetarity, a world that is worlding and not only netospherically, as in globalization, but nethospherically, quote, sensitive to formations, workings, and implications of a world relationality that escape or are disadvantaged by the co-opting theory of corporations, markets, and empires, by the serial, the formulaic, the universal, the easily or apparently classifiable and profitable. Seeing a photograph of the whole Earth would seem to have planetary potential." While the countercultural movements of the late 60s vibrated with the possibilities latent in facing the Earth, NASA had its eyes on the moon. The photographs of Earth that changed the discourse were felicitous byproducts, essayistic digressions, we might say. The astronauts were not supposed to be taking pictures out of the windows, but they did, and in 1968, these errancies resulted in the now famous Earthrise photograph, which we've just seen recently again. That moment, it has been argued, changed everything. Satisfied that NASA came through, Stuart Brand put Earthrise on the cover of his Whole Earth catalog, the realization of his desire to help connect all humans and give them a way to realize their uniqueness and purpose on this rare Earth. Earthrise began to bend human consciousness, he writes. But the rhetoric around the Earthrise photo was maybe not all that planetary in the spirit in which we're considering it here. While it is true that the first photos of the whole Earth galvanized the environmentalist movement, led to the creation of Earth Day, and encouraged humans to understand themselves as part of an ecosystem that exceeded national and political boundaries, some of the triumphalist language that succeeded the publication of the Earthrise photo courted a new kind of universalism. "We are first and foremost not Germans or Russians or Americans," Frank Borman, the Apollo 8 astronaut responsible for the photo, told an audience in Bonn, "but Earthmen." Quote, "We saw the Earth, the size of a quarter, and we recognized that there really is one world." On Christmas Day, 1968, the astronauts, still aboard Apollo 8 and only hours from having taken the Earthrise photo, read the opening of Genesis for a global audience. "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and God saw that it was good." The spirit of Genesis, "Be stewards of the whole earth because it is yours," pervades the whole earth rhetoric. Critical to both planetary thinking and the spirit of the essay is the persistence of the non-identical, the consciousness of non-identity, as Adorno puts it, the accentuation of the partial against the total. Particulars in the essay remain fragmentary, ironic, neither subsumed by systems nor rounded out and made categorical in and of themselves. Similarly, for Gayatri Spivak, planet thought embraces an inexhaustible taxonomy, including but not identical with the whole range of human universals. As planetary subjects, she writes, alterity remains underived from us. It is not our dialectical negation. It contains us as much as it flings us away. The theme of the emergent whole earth rhetoric, perhaps best captured by the Whole Earth catalog, is not one of alterity. It celebrates particularity, but in the form of individualism. It faces the planet, but sees that face as identical with the human viewer. The stated purpose of the catalog is this: we are as gods and might as well get good at it. In other words, the revelation of the Earthrise photo for Brand and his followers was that the whole Earth is us. The planet's face is our face, and we should feel empowered as individuals to inhabit the Earth and care for it, to recognize our universal brotherhood. Only in getting outside of ourselves, he writes, do we gain the perspective to see, quote, Earth as a tool, and how to understand it better, to use it better. One senses the rich particularity of the planet in the whole Earth catalog, not as a series of questions posed so softly that formal expression would be too much and too little, that's Lukács, but answers, pieces of a world system made complete in the image of the world, of the Earth's face. Every time I read it, I'm moved by the parenthetical in Montaigne's brief note to the reader at the beginning of the essays. He writes, I have dedicated it to the private convenience of my relatives and friends, so that when they have lost me, as soon they must, they may recover here some features of my habits and temperament, and by this means keep the knowledge they have had of me more complete and alive. We might say the same of the golden record on the Voyager space probe. For all of the celebration of the Voyager essay as an interstellar message from a living planet, the opening gambit in some dialogue across the galaxy, as one of the authors of the Voyager essay puts it, we would welcome, indeed relish, a dialogue with another interlocutory civilization elsewhere in the cosmos. The story of its crafting ends on a note of melancholy. We too were time capsuling, searching the skies, Carl Sagan writes. We were a species endowed with hope. Past tense. Like Montaigne, Carl Sagan and his team recognized that the Voyager essay was perhaps a memento mori, a labyrinthine columbarium carrying fragments of the dead Earth. I'm not certain that this tempers the hubris of sending a personal essay out into space, or keeps it from being triumphalist in the manner of the whole Earth catalog, but it does trace the edges of the alterity essential to planetary thinking. We were, which is to say, we are not. On the one hand, we are not is a complete sentence, a scandal of language like we are dead. But we are not might also be the beginning of a list, characterized negatively, an apophatic list, the essential impossibility of speaking the planet. The primary authors of the Voyager Golden Record describe the project this way. They were aware that if the Voyager essay only told, quote, stories about people, per Adorno, it would be a bad essay. The title of the audio essay, The Sounds of Earth, the whole essay, the whole project presents as an essay, but in their accounting, they singled out the audio essay for its particularly essayistic qualities. When I refer to the Voyager essay, I'm talking about the whole thing. Gestures to their incipient planetary thinking. It's worth listing the things the 6 primary authors and their hundreds of collaborators had to consider as they crafted the crafted this extraplanetary essay, because it might serve us in thinking about the demands and difficulties of a truly planetary writing. 1, the limits of communication across space and time and beings. 2, the fair and accurate representation of A, the longue durée of Earth, geological, biological, evolutionary. B, the vast and interconnected network of Earth species, living and extinct. C, all of humanity and human civilization in space and time. 3, the limited capacity of the medium, an essay, not a book, with roughly 120 minutes of playing time. 4, the reactions and parochial vanities of the human audience. And 5, the global political landscape in 1977, not least of which included the Cold War and the real fear that any missile object seemingly headed spaceward was in fact a doomsday gift from a bellicose nation. The authors also had to negotiate turf wars between the United Nations, NASA, the Carter administration in the US, and the members of the US House and Senate who thought they should be named on the record. And specific and colorful fears by the Vox Populi. Some people were afraid that if we sent a message, aliens would know our location and come attack us. The authors worried that if they sent frank accounts of Earth's internecine struggles and brimming arsenals, the aliens would perceive the message as an act of aggression. Other communicants objected to any nude images on the record because, quote, we shouldn't be sending pornography to space. Above all else, the international collaborators recognized that they needed to navigate between the particular and the general, the non-identical relationship between what they could represent in the Voyager essay and the actual teeming mass of particularity on Earth. They began in full awareness of the limits of what could be said and the vast and diverse catalog of things that wouldn't make the cut. One notable instance of this insistence on the non-identical by all the hundreds of collaborators was the complaint that the sketches of the two human figures resembled too closely their own race, when it should in fact be both singular and ecumenical. But curiously, everyone from the dozens of countries and ethnicities participating worried that they saw too much of themselves in the sketches. Particularity mattered, but not partiality. The more specific the information is to Earth, Carl Sagan writes, the more anecdotal or idiosyncratic, the more difficult it may be for extraterrestrials to understand, but also the more valuable the information will be once understood. The essay form, as we understand it, is critical and ironic. It ironically adapts itself to the eternal smallness of the most profound work in the face of life. That's Lukács again. How does one educe criticality and irony for an extraterrestrial audience? How did these international collaborators toggle outward from a self to a world self or global self to a planetary self? Let me put this differently. If we, students of the essay, understand that the essay is ironic, negatively dialectical, non-totalizing, representing particulars while at the same time representing their incomplete subsumption in an ever-receding whole, the specter of an extraterrestrial reader pushes us to account for how that works, how an ET might be able to recognize such essayism, or even how an audience of 8 billion non-specialists might perceive it. The authors express the hope that the recipients of the message will recognize the vast plenum exerting pressure on the surface of the essay. Quote, if the denizens of a distant planet can make sense of the essay, perhaps they will not be wholly unacquainted with the paradoxes time engenders and will listen in a tolerant spirit, writes co-architect Anne Droyan. Elsewhere, as they are stitching together brief sentences, simpler boilerplate greetings mostly, but not entirely, take, for example, the Amoy speaker from Eastern China who says, friends of space, how are you all? Have you eaten yet? From the almost 60 languages represented in the essay, they hope that the pauses and interruptions, the fragments and implied question marks will signal the essay's fragmentary nature and point deictically to what isn't included. I can't exactly account for the extraterrestrial perspective. A group called SETI-X tried, in 2010, releasing a remixed golden record titled Scrambles of Earth, the Voyager interstellar record remixed by extraterrestrials. Though I'll venture some suggestions. I also can't cover everything about the Voyager essay. Instead, I'll consider a few key aspects that might be instructive for us here. 1. Stephen Tolman. One of Sagan's first recruits to the Voyager essay project was the British philosopher Stephen Tolman. Although Tolman's most influential book is perhaps The Uses of Argument, published in 1958, he had most recently published Human Understanding, the Collective Use and Evolution of Concepts. The central questions of the book begin here. What is man that he may understand the world? And what is the world that man may understand it? Tolman is interested in a reflective, self-aware, historically inflected, and evolutionary examination of the development and mutation of concepts, of the, quote, skills or traditions, activities, procedures, or instruments of man's intellectual life and imagination, in a word, the concepts, through which that human understanding is achieved and expressed. One can imagine Sagan asking Toulmin for help writing a conceptual guide to the particulars of Earth that takes into full consideration its evolutionary scale and scope for extraterrestrial minds. We do know one of the things Toulmin warned the Voyager team about was the, quote, tendency in such time capsule messages to represent human beings as individuals and without stressing the importance of community. But Toulmin's 1972 book on the evolution of concepts suggests also an answer for us in thinking about the planetary essay, one derived from Montaigne and much later the Frankfurt School, because Toulmin was concerned with finding a third way of thinking about the use and history of concepts, a way between hyper-rational absolutism and extreme relativist empiricism. In fact, he opens his book with the Montaignian question: what sort of things do we know? What kinds of certainty can our knowledge have? A few pages later, he refers us to Montaigne's Apology for Raymond Sebond, in which Montaigne, quote, questioned whether humans could ever have rational grounds for deciding between opposed systems of theory. And as Mario mentioned yesterday, the Sebond essay is maybe the most planetary of Montaigne's essays, wandering as it does through animal, vegetable, and celestial relationships that he finds provocatively other than humanity's familiar accounts of them. What we know of Toulmin's thinking around the moment of his recruitment to the Voyager essay team is that he advocated for an awareness of the standpoint of concepts. Consider Lukács on the standpoint of the essay, and calls this middle way between absolutism and relativism open-textured and non-final. Recall for a moment James Agee's commitment to the open terms of the essay to represent the universal plenitude of the landscape and humans about which he was writing. If Toulmin had advice for Sagan about concepts, we can imagine that advice was to make sure they represented their own limits, gestured toward their own inadequacy, or, as Lawrence Buell puts it, adequation, representations that bridge, via style, the abyss between language and the object world. 2, the sound essay. There are only 3, don't worry. Toulmin's argument for the evolutionary standpoint of concepts is loosely reflected in the evolutionary audio essay on the sounds of Earth. If we've been considering the face of the world versus the face of the planet as we try to describe planetary representation, the audio essay might be considered the voice of the planet, as opposed to the voice of individuals or the world. It attempts to record, we might say, the alterity of the planet. The essay thus speaks in geological, meteorological, technological, and biological idioms. It begins with a musical readout of Johannes Kepler's Harmonices Mundi, recorded by Laurie Spiegel on a computer at Bell Laboratories. This is 1977. The excerpt on the record corresponds to, quote, roughly a century of planetary motion. It's an estranging, altering way to begin. The mind wants to make the whirling tones, one frequency for each of the 6 planets Kepler would have known, into a familiar music, but can't, not quite. The essay then moves from the music of the spheres through interwoven mudpots, earthquakes, volcanoes, wind and rain. It's very strange to listen to. Volcanoes, wind and rain, to birds, insects, chimpanzees, footsteps, fire, laughter, a kiss, and improbably a recording of an electroencephalogram, a literal recording of someone's thoughts, or thought itself. I lost some minutes wondering what Montaigne would think of that. The evolutionary essay ends with a recording of a pulsar, a rotating neutron star that spits electromagnetic beams out of each of its twin magnetic poles. The radiation is visible only when a pole is facing Earth, which happens twice per rotation, which means it appears as 2 points of radiation per rotation, dot, rotate, dot. To human ears, the primary authors of the Voyager essay tell us, and I can confirm having listened to it, it sounds like the rasp of a phonograph needle left to languish unattended at the end of a record. Or perhaps not the end, importantly, but at the end of one side. The pulsar sounds like the point at which we recognize there is more to the record. It has more to say, but not right now. The bumping stylus tells us that we need to flip it. The essay stops when it feels finished, not when there is nothing left to say. 3, kilometry. The stylus leaves us dangling, Daniel Chua and Alexander Redding write, on the edge of the abyss, a gap of contingent possibilities. Authors of Alien Listening, this is real, a book of exomusicology, these musicologists agree that alterity, underived from humans, is imminent in the Voyager essay. It is underived from us because, in the case of the images on the Voyager, we cannot hear it, and in the case of the music, we cannot see it, and in the form by which it might be received by extraterrestrials, we can't really imagine it. It's not our negation. But the phonographic means of transmission guarantees these sensory possibilities and unperceived connections are still there. Grooves on the record, a 30 hertz frequency. But we can arrive at this gap of contingent possibilities as humans, as I've been suggesting. What we can hear is the music included as part of the Voyager essay, and they suggest other ways the radical alterity of planetary thinking might emerge. Consider the fugue. The authors of the Voyager essay had idiosyncratic methods for choosing the music that they would send to space, but there was a certain logic behind their choices. The anchoring logic was representation, as many countries and traditions as possible, but they also considered the aliens. J.S. Bach's Fugue No. 1 in C major from Book 2 of the Well-Tempered Clavier made the cut because the authors hoped that the mathematical principles that organize fugues would translate. Briefly, Bach's fugues dilute the dissonances and disharmonies inherent to octave-based Western music by transferring and working out those dissonances in repetitions and elaborations along the octave. Fugues are dialectical. They pose a problem, experiment, and eventually resolve. Adorno saw them as eminently rational, a perfect figure for Enlightenment reason. That's probably true. But one fugue of the 24 in the Well-Tempered Clavier cannot do this. It leaves the fugal structure incomplete, unresolved, negative. It suggests, in other words, fragmentariness, the accentuation of the partial against the total. This broken fugue structure recurs in the music of the Golden Record, the Voyager essay. Blind Willie Johnson's blues song, Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground, turns on the melancholy irresolution between the calling of the guitar and the humming and moaning of its interlocutor. That toggling ambivalence is apparent in the name of Johnson's song, which contains both firmament and earth, and suggests that the yawning mystery of the former, Dark Was the Night, returns us with some melancholy to the solid fact of the former, Cold Was the Ground, and back again. But the broader point is that these unresolved fragments are stitched together like the sentences of an essay, and, because we cannot imagine extraterrestrial perception, their purely conjectural ligaments from an extraplanetary perspective invite us to reimagine identity, resolution, conclusion, to trade assurance in for uncanny linkages, catachresis, alterity. We need a technology that preserves the non-identity of the other, write the authors of Alien Listening. For them, this technology is music. Their book focuses almost exclusively on the songs archived on the Golden Record. Music, for them, is essentially a gap, the synaptic possibility for connections, because, as they define it, music is a blink, a winking single dot, that forms a signal by being both positive and negative at once. Blink. An exercise in alien listening. But the Voyager interstellar message is bigger than its music. It is an essay. I am suggesting that the authors of the Voyager essay understood this as the technology that preserves the non-identity of the other, planetary and extraplanetary, and that perhaps its own blinking signal, positive and negative at once, would be perceptible in one way or another across space and time and alterity. This returns me to James Agee's unresolved sonata form. It was the only pattern he could think of, theme and modulation without tonal resolution, that would get at the planetary he wished to express, quote, as if all in one sentence, and spread suspension and flight or fugue of music, all its intersections and in the meanings of its interrelations and interenhancements, that whole landscape we shall essay. This is all one colon, he writes. The Voyager essay does this on a grand scale, essaying the face of the planet as a set of interrelated particulars that should never be understood as one perfectly end-stopped sentence, a whole Earth, a world self. If the unresolved sonata or fugue gives us the pattern, its syntactic signature is the colon, an exercise perhaps in alien reading. The colon also blinks. All punctuation is modeled on traffic signals, says Adorno. The colon is green. He also calls it a dominant seventh chord, which is the chord penultimate to tonic resolution. Stop, go, positive, negative. There is more to say, more to know. The security of an independent clause, human certainty, uses the essayistic logic of the colon, two blinking ends of a pulsar, exosemiotics, to move beyond itself, maybe not into an alterity wholly underived from itself, but also not a dependent clause, an unresolved fugue, an open texture, a gap of contingent possibilities, dot, rotate, dot. Sagan is sure that the extraterrestrials who receive the Voyager Golden Record will know that, quote, we were a species endowed with hope and perseverance. Past tense, we were, we are not. But because the Voyager Golden Record is an extraplanetary essay, I think it both says something less and more than that. How does one write an extraplanetary essay, or even a planetary essay, about a planetary self? The Voyager essay writes, we were not. We are not, we are, colon. Let me just say in advance that I'm not a physicist.
I'll also say I'm absolutely not a physicist. I hope my question makes sense, because anyone who talks about space gets my inner child very eager, and your talk was so good and so cool. So thank you very much for that. I guess what I'm asking is this. When the extraplanetary comes into play, and that sense of scale comes in, it is an oft realized notion that feelings of indifference, insignificance, and apathy come in. The people I can think of who wrote about this would be Lyotard and Thomas Nagel and stuff like that. In a way, it turns the dot, dot of the colon into a dot, dot, dot of the ellipse, of the, I don't know, it's a shrug. Now, your talk made me realize this, and maybe you could verify this or expand on it or negate it. Does the indifference and apathy that might come with thinking extraplanetarily in a way lead into this, or help even, the fragmentation of the essay, the lack of passion when it comes to not carrying out an argument, but instead meandering and moving from birdsong to volcano or laughter. Do these essays that you've been talking about, whether it's the Voyager records or any other literature you might have read around this, incorporate in a visible way these senses of apathy and indifference and harness them to fragment themselves more? Thanks.
It's a good question. It takes me back to James Agee, actually, who, when he was working on Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, ran up against this same, not indifference, but sort of, I can't do this. There's no possible way to do this. Maybe no one will care. And certainly at the moment, no one did. Eventually they did. But that sort of trailing off, and it's also figured at the end of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men in the inability to work out the foxes. And it's actually it's a figure at the end because the two authors are falling asleep while they're listening to this. And so they wake up and it's still happening. And that feels to me as sort of like the form. One imagines the kind of argumentative project as you're always awake, you're always watchful, maybe you're always defensive. But the essay allows for a kind of quiescence. And it's figured also in the trajectory of the Voyager probe, which has been traveling, and then it turns up really cool images, but other things happen on Earth and no one cares. And then they do care, and now they care again. I mean, it's back, right? We had a long ellipse, which turned out to be a colon. And I think that's the turn, right? That you go from saying, this is languishing, we're dropping off to consider other things, but it remains. The potential, which is kinetic sometimes, becomes purely potential energy other times. And that we keep finding again and again the brink, and the essay allows for those quiescent moments to then reawaken and say, oh wait, that was a colon and not, as you put it so beautifully, an ellipse.
Other questions? Otherwise, I actually might have a question relating it to one of the panels I was in yesterday on the blue humanities. And I was wondering to what extent the record has a kind of terrestrial bias, you could say, or to what extent it also includes aquatic life, sounds, images, because indeed more than half of the Earth is covered with water. Mm-hmm. And again, sorry to keep talking about Star Trek, but in one of the movies, you might know, aliens do arrive at Earth on the basis of whale sounds. And they think that the whales are the most important species on the Earth.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because so you listen to the Voyager essay, and it sounds like a whole. There's the section that is named the evolutionary audio essay, and in that we get the sounds of tides, the water, the sound of rain. But then when you get to the languages, which are these greetings spoken in all of these different languages with their idiosyncrasies and pauses, the authors said, and when I first read about it before listening to it, they said we also included whale song. And instead of including whale song as part of the evolutionary audio essay, they actually include it with the human languages. But they don't include it with the human languages as in sequence. It actually underwrites. It's played during all of the greetings. So you're hearing the sound of the whales as this kind of tidal force underneath all of the human greetings, which gives the effect of a fluid song happening underneath these greetings, an image perhaps of these terrestrial islands with this fluid structure. And so the whale song was actually, the whales and the aquatic was significant for the architects of the record. In addition, it was actually dolphin communication in water that inspired the kind of exolinguistic project. And in fact, the first people to really think about how we would make these communications named themselves the Order of the Dolphin. And Sagan would send things, he was a member, but he would also send things to the Order of the Dolphin to see if they could figure it out. So the water is present, kind of as it's present on Earth, as this tidal force on the record.
Thank you. I think there should be room for one final question.
Thank you. This was amazing. Absolutely incredible, Kara. Thank you. Okay, so I tried to write these down so I wouldn't take too long. So what are the capacities, do you think, that the Golden Record imagines for its essay in terms of its both like the readership of it, the readership or recipients of it? I had always thought of it as a descriptive document, and now I think of it as a pedagogical document. And or maybe it's something else, like or many other things. Second part to this is, what do these kinds of the planetary essays that you're talking about today help us to think about what we want to teach or to learn through essaying, or the possibilities of teaching and learning?
So the first question, I mean, they really first and foremost understood this as the beginning of a dialogue. You know, however optimistic or nonsensical that sounds, it really was, this is meant to be the opening. It had, as Peter puts it, you know, the internal Socratic gambit. This is the opening of a dialogue. We want you to have questions about us. And so more than descriptive, I think throughout the authors describing the project, they continue to think, like, what are the questions that this would raise? What is the question that someone would have after hearing this? What question would this? So it's always, I mean, it's rather than descriptive, it's sort of self-interrogative. And they abandoned very quickly the notion that this would be in any way descriptive. Also aware that that the primary audience would be humans who would always be unhappy with whatever, I mean, it would be the problem of a list. And so I think they turned the list into something with a question mark after every inclusion, you know, this, but what else? This, but what else? Which also, you imagine them thinking of the extraterrestrials. What questions, you know, as we say in the classroom, what questions do you have for us? And that maybe gets to the pedagogical part of it. You know, what is the always interrogative potential in these forms? I'm very interested in the poetics of the essay and in the poetics then of the planetary. How do we see it latent in our sentences, in the ellipse, in the way that we're putting together things that feel in their kind of end-stopped completion, that actually contain within them the possibilities for something else, for the sentence that breaks off halfway, and then you have to say, well, what comes next? How is it that the essay gives us a form for an actual physical poetics of uncertainty? And that's something that, for me, is understanding how that's just baked into something like the planetary essay here, right? The extraplanetary essay. Even I mean, I actually found myself almost saying this to a graduate student. Try to imagine if you were writing for a space alien, you know, like how do you need to think about style? How do you need to think about communicating at all levels, that this remains open, that there are amplifications and extrapolations possible?
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks again for this wonderful talk. Yeah.